Good morning. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Mark Cummings. Mark is a professor and Notre Dame chair in psychology here at Notre Dame, and he's also a core faculty member in the Shaw Center for Children and Families. His research interests focus on family factors, especially socio-emotional processes associated with normal development and the development of psychopathology in children. He has many directions, but some of his current directions include longitudinal studies of the influences of marital conflict and family processes on children's adjustment, the role of community, family, and children's emotional security in relations between political violence and child adjustment, and research-based prevention and parent education programs. Another interest is a theory that he and his colleague Patrick Davies developed, referred to as the emotional security theory, which serves as a general theoretical model for children's development in families and communities. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cummings.
Thanks, Julie. So my talk is on marital conflict and its effects on children. So you're probably thinking, this is a conference on child flourishing, and why are we talking about marital conflict? Isn't that a negative? Well, I could say kids should be tougher and learn how to deal with it, but that's not what I'm going to say. What I'm going to say is that marital conflict has a bad rap, that it's seen as a negative, but actually can be quite a positive in children's development. And I want to advance the premise that that's a good thing because we all have conflicts in our lives. And so the question is, fortunately, how to handle the conflicts, not whether to have conflicts. Now you might think to yourself, well, I never have conflicts. Maybe Dr. Cummings does in his family, but, but I don't. Well, let's think about it, though. Aren't there things to be done each day in a family, like take the garbage out or kick the kids to soccer practice or baseball practice, whatever? Do you always do those things? But even if you do always do them, do you feel good about it? No, you don't. So that's conflict. It's negative feelings between marital partners is conflict, whether it's spoken or unspoken. And the way to handle that, I'm going to advance the premise, is not to avoid it or not talk about it, because then kids are quite sensitive, we know from our research, quite sensitive to negative conflict. The way to handle it is to handle it constructively. So we're going to talk today about constructive conflict as a way to foster child flourishing. But first I want to make it clear that, does this work, or walk around, or no? Okay. What's this? Oh, this part. Okay. I'll just stand here. This is too technological for me. But I want to first of all say that it is true that negative marital conflict, what we call destructive conflict, is a negative for children. This is well established. High marital conflicts linked with psychopathology in children, poor relationships between peers, academic problems, and physiological and health symptoms. So we've shown that high conflict impacts children at the level of cortisol functioning, skin conductance. These are different measures of different aspects of physiological functioning, alpha amylase. So we've documented actual biological impacts of marital conflict on children. So it's not to say that conflict isn't potentially a negative for children. In fact, it's one of the best established predictors of adjustment problems in children is high rates of destructive conflict between parents. So the point is not to say conflict is not something to be concerned about, destructive conflict, but it's more to break apart the characteristics of conflict and try to distinguish ways of handling conflict which are positive versus those which are not positive, which I think is the key towards people handling conflict better in order to foster children's flourishing. So conflict tends to be a kind of a negative, in a kind of amorphous way in the public's mind, in many people's mind. Marital conflict is a negative. And even researchers for many years treated it the same way. Marital discord was the common term for interparental conflict, And it was seen as kind of an amorphous, homogeneous stimulus, a negative, that you put in your equations to predict adjustment problems in psychopathology research, and it would be a reliable predictor. But conflict is not a homogeneous stimulus, always a negative event in the family. Even with regard to destructive conflict, there are many different types of ways conflict can be destructive. The most familiar way is verbal conflict or physical aggression between parents. These are negative conflict behaviors, certainly. But there are other types of conflict which are also negative. In some of our early research, we wanted to look into that. It's not been like nonverbal conflict and stonewalling and other types of nonverbal, non-physical conflict were often neglected in characterizations of what is destructive conflict. We did some early research showing kids conflict on analog methodologies, like showing them videos of adults and say, if these were your parents, how would you feel? Then we'd have them rate on, say, a 5-point scale their emotional responses: angry, sad, mad, scared, or happy. And destructive marital conflict, like verbal or physical aggression, would often get a 4 or 5 on a negative scale. But nonverbal conflict did too. Kids were just as upset about nonverbal conflict as verbal conflict. So this is something we uncovered in early research that we did using more experimental methods, but we've subsequently shown this in the home as well. So verbal conflict is actually negative too. In some studies, it's actually predicting more negative effects long-term than verbal conflict, because, well, why would that be? We think one reason is when conflict isn't spoken, isn't characterized overtly, it can't be resolved, okay? So you can't move towards a positive outcome. Okay, but a more maybe groundbreaking or interesting finding was there are types of conflict actually which are positive for kids. Okay, and this is something that emerged also in early research we did, where we showed kids different types of conflict, handling conflict, in the midst of a disagreement. And we found there are certain types of conflict that not only didn't elicit negative responses, but actually listed positive responses from children. So they actually felt good about seeing it. So it wasn't just a non-negative, it was a positive. And this is a hopeful sign for those of us in relationships, because, of course, we're not going to always have positive characterizations in relationships. Things aren't going to always, we have to talk about things, in other words. So if we do it well, though, it can be a positive. And these are some of the behaviors we've shown can be constructive. That is, are linked with positive outcomes in kids, both in the short and long term. Problem solving, compromise, during conflict, support, affection, apology, and parental humor. Now, some of these are more reliably positive than others. For example, parental humor isn't always so positive, as you can imagine. Sometimes when people say things that are, quote, funny, it's not really funny. It's kind of insulting or, not a setback in the communication. Apology also doesn't really work things out. And kids know this. You do research on responses of kids to interparental apology. And kids know that that's not necessarily a positive, okay? Because is it sincere, or does it, well, minimally it doesn't address the issue. It just says, I'm sorry for it. But then, so more positive outcomes are problem-solving, compromise. And I thought since necessarily positive types of conflict aren't necessarily as well known, I'll show a couple examples of positive conflict to illustrate some of the constructive behaviors, some of the behaviors we know actually kids respond to in a positive way. Okay. Oh. Okay, so here's a problem solving. And we'll return to my theme of being technologically challenged for a moment. This might work. Okay, this is problem solving. Example of that from one of our studies.
How about I pick up the kids tomorrow since you have
had a
class,
fight. This is at the end of the fight.
And on Wednesday, since I have to work late, you can pick them up and take them to practice.
Well, that sounds like that would work out great. Thanks, that's a good idea.
So they had a fight about who's going to take kids to practice, and they worked it out by compromising, agreeing on a solution. That's kind of an ideal ending for conflict, a way of handling conflict, that is. Another type of positive behavior is resolution. Oh, I have to go, did I do it wrong? Okay.
How about I pick up the kids tomorrow since you have your class, and then on Wednesday,
Oh.
since I have to work late, you can pick them up and take them to
Okay,
practice.
we're revisiting
That
this. It was
sounds
an
like that
important
would work
point,
out
so we're going over it
great.
again.
Thanks, that's a good idea.
I need to do the click it here, right? Oh, went pretty far. Okay. Okay, so looks like I'm on the right track finally. Okay. This is resolve. This is one of the real key points, this resolution as a goal. So they had a big fight. This is not like just chatting, and then they work it out.
I know, honey. I know you work hard. And I know being with the kids all day is stressful. Why don't we just find something else to make?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry I was so short with you. I've been so busy lately.
I understand. And I really do want to help out. How about I make dinner every Tuesday and Thursday?
Yes, that would be great. And then because you'd be helping out on those days, we could have dinner later, and so you could relax after work.
I really appreciate that. Because I need some time off, so I don't bring the stress home from work. Now, don't we have a frozen lasagna around here someplace?
So that's a resolved conflict. This illustrates also a research hazard, which is that it's much easier to get actors to act angry than to act positive. These are actually professional actors, and I found in early work in our research, we could even get, people in the staff, anyone could be angry, and we all got that down pat, but to be credibly positive is much more challenging. But that's a side point, just for you research types, you can take notes on that. Okay, but we found though in our research then, comparing kids' response to very specific types of conflict, that the way conflict happens really matters a lot, okay? So it's not having conflict, it's how conflict transpires and how it ends, which is a huge difference. Now, so the question is, does conflict resolution matter? And this was something we found almost by happenstance. I was doing a study a number of years ago, a different university, with a lesser football team, at least this year, although some years not so much. But anyway, so I had a experimental study I was doing using analog presentations of different types of conflict. And I had 6 scenarios. So I had verbal conflict, verbal physical conflict, and nonverbal conflict. And then I had control conditions of neutral versions of each. But I'd figured out in pilot study I could do 8 scenarios. So I thought, well, I'll just throw in a scenario where I start in a positive way for 30 seconds and end in a negative way, or start in a negative way and end in a positive way, just to sort of fill things out. I didn't really think it necessarily would matter. But basically that's a condition of talking about the same thing, the same actors, and doing it, handling it in a positive, resolved way or unresolved, which is how it played out. And I thought, well, this is interesting. Looked at the difference in responding, and the responses to the fight with 30 seconds of negative and 30 seconds of positive, with the positive first and then negative, kids were on a 4.5 and a 5-point scale in terms of negativity. But in terms of the fight where it started out negative, ended positive, kids were around 0 in responding, in terms of negativity responding. Now we did analysis of variance in this particular study, and the F value reflecting the difference between the conditions was around 1,000. So that's the kind of effects you want, 1,000. Like P less than 1 and all the sands in the ocean or the beaches or whatever the heck, it was definitely an effect. It was huge, and it just came out just so by accident. I thought this resolution thing might be really interesting. So we decided to look more at resolution. This effect came out by accident in this early study. And it seemed like resolution might be kind of a silver bullet for helping kids handle conflict better. It's not necessarily the greatest analogy, because that's more like this werewolf thing, right? And the Twilight and all that kind of stuff. I don't know. I don't follow those shows. I actually developed this term before those shows came out, the silver bullet. But anyway, I guess it kills werewolves. I don't know. Okay, so now let's see. Go back to, no, I want to continue on with the same. Okay. So, can resolution ameliorate the impact of conflict? Okay, This is one of our early studies then, where you'll see these findings and these huge F values. So we looked at mode of expression of conflict and whether conflict was resolved. This is exactly the same study I was just talking about. Kids were between 4 and 9. And so all anger reactions that weren't resolved were seen as quite negative, whether they were verbal or nonverbal or verbal physical. But unresolved anger was quite negative, but resolved anger was seen as positive, okay? And whether it occurred after a nonverbal conflict, a verbal conflict, or even a verbal physical conflict, resolution made a huge difference. These are big effects. So we did some follow-up work on this, showing that as children got older, they perceived hostile anger as even more negative, and boys reacted more negatively than girls. And older children responded with more distress to unresolved anger than resolved. Now, I should say with regard to gender differences are not consistent in this literature, so this is what we find in this study, but basically boys and girls are equally affected. Some of the early work suggested that boys were more affected than girls by marital conflict, but it turned out that was, and so there's all these theories about, the boys are more, the weaker sex, whatever, all these different theories. But it turned out people were going to clinics to get the subjects, and a lot of the subjects in clinics were boys. But really what's turned out now is boys and girls are equally vulnerable to conflict, destructive conflict. So that finding, actually, we found in this particular study doesn't really replicate. Okay, so children are highly sensitive to whether conflicts are resolved. And it makes a huge difference. Okay, so we did a study looking at the types of resolution, how they mattered. So the different ways to resolving conflict, right? Which ways are the ideal ways, or which ones are less ideal? Now, the really best way to resolve conflict from the child's point of view, we asked the children, how would you respond if your parents behaved in this way at the end of a conflict? This is always at the end of a conflict. So the nice thing about analog stimuli is you can control the anger stimulus. That's always the same in this study. We put different endings on the end. So you absolutely control how much anger is being expressed about the issue at hand, the family issue, whatever it might be. So it's only the endings that make a difference. But resolved conflict, compromise, and apology made a huge difference in reducing negative impact. Partially resolved conflicts also helped. So changing the topic or one side giving in to the other helped a lot, but not totally. Kids were still somewhat upset by the conflict. Now, unresolved conflict, where the parents keep fighting, or they lapsed into stonewalling or the silent treatment, actually were seen as quite negative. And the nonverbal ending was seen as just as negative for these 5 to 19-year-olds as the verbal ending. Now, it's an interesting twist. In later research, we looked at how parents versus kids respond to one type of partially resolved conflict, the submission form. And we found that actually parents think submission is a full resolution, but kids don't. So kids actually see submission as only partially resolved. I think the kids are probably right, because if one side gives into the other, that's not really working it out, right? So there's some nuance in this in terms of how kids versus parents view these different types of conflict behaviors. Although, I should say, typically, parents and kids see the different behaviors having the same meaning for relationships. Okay, so for all ages then, resolved conflict was perceived as by far the least angry, not even upsetting, very upsetting, while unresolved anger was seen as quite upsetting to the child. Okay, and partial resolution was perceived as better than unresolved, but still not a complete resolution. So you see kind of a hierarchy of behaviors then of how you handle conflict. So we've talked about how behaviors during conflict can matter in terms of whether kids feel okay or not, and also behaviors at the end. And how conflicts end is really important. Parents can have a really negative conflict, but if it ends in a resolved way, children can come away not feeling at all bad about it. In fact, I'll talk a little bit about this. Recent research we've shown they actually feel good about it. It actually makes them feel more secure. So children, the impact of interparental conflict then is on children is ameliorated by conflict resolution. One question then is, how does resolution have to occur? Does it have to occur in front of the children? So do people have to go around like resolving and say, hey, Joey, come here, we're going to resolve this now, like that kind of thing? Or can you just work it out and will kids pick up on it? Well, the good news is kids are very sensitive to the quality of relationships between parents. And they can pick up on resolution when they don't see it. We did this study where we looked at how kids respond to resolution behind closed doors. So the parents that have a fight, this is again an analog situation. We show them a fight, say, imagine this is your parents, and they have a fight, and they go behind closed doors, and they come back, and in one condition, they actually resolve it to the kids. Another condition, they just look like they're okay. They don't actually work it out. And what we found was the condition where the parents looked okay but didn't actually work it out, the kids were really good with that. We couldn't even distinguish it from when they did work it out in front of the kids. Kids pick up on the cues. In other words, they were really good with it. They're about as good as you can get with it, even though they didn't see the actual resolution. They inferred it happened behind closed doors. And we asked the kids, what do you think was going on behind closed doors? And even the 5-year-olds would say they were trying to work it out. They didn't see them working it out. They just inferred it. They go behind closed doors. They come back. They must have been trying to work it out. If they look okay, they worked it out. And kids put that together, 2 and 2 put together, even young kids. So this is a real strong indication then. You don't have to work out conflicts in front of the kids. They'll pick up on whether you worked it out some other way. We did another study where we had parents have a fight and then like a day or two later talk about how they worked it out. The kids didn't see the resolution, they just heard about the resolution. And that also is very beneficial. So kids can pick up on the emotional meaning of conflict for a variety of channels of information. These are the statistics that back up what I said. Over half the 5-year-olds inferred adults were working it out behind closed doors. And reactions to unresolved conflict were indistinguishable. Unobserved resolution were indistinguishable from actually seeing resolution. When they had that cue, they were behind closed doors after a fight and they looked okay. They could pick that up. Okay, this is a study where we show the explanation. Then we have the citations here in little small print. The explanation a day or two later about having worked it out was sufficient. The kids didn't have to see it or see it immediately or even see it at all, but just hear about it from the parents. They would appreciate resolution that occurred and they would feel okay about the conflict. So that's good news because, it'd be kind of awkward to have to kind of work out everything right in front of the kids. Like, oh, I saw on TV Dr. Cummings said we have to work it out. So, these unnatural things, it wouldn't really. Kids pick up on the genuineness too. So you have to be sincere, okay? And it'd be kind of awkward if everyone's running around, getting the kids lined up. Let's work it out. Now, I really don't mind driving you to soccer, even though I don't like soccer, because we're compromising here, right? No, that doesn't work. I love soccer, put it that way. I know some of you love soccer, but anyway, baseball, put baseball in, it's the same thing. Okay, but they don't have to see it firsthand. We're very sports-oriented at Notre Dame. Okay, now here's a clip of, especially when we're winning. Here's the resolution behind closed doors. Okay. Just to show you what this stimulus looked like in our research.
What's wrong? Why are you two fighting?
Don't worry, Mom and I just need to talk.
Okay.
Why don't we go into the other room and talk about this? You're right. I'm glad we talked about this. I feel so much better now. I love you.
I love you too. Making dinner together was a great compromise. Look, why don't you make the pasta and I'll make the sauce?
I'll set the table.
Yeah, this positive stuff's not natural for us, is it? Okay, we should have an intensive workshop, how to act positive in a credible way. Anyway, Does exposure to all types of conflict elicit negative responses? So a question at this point arose, okay, we did a lot of experimental studies which show these effects, but it's not actually in the home. And what happens in the home in this regard? And how do you get into the home? Okay, so can we observe marital conflict in the home and document these same effects? And there's a challenge because, can we send our research assistants to people's homes to see marital conflict? Okay, first of all, it might not occur in front of the kids, or in front of the research assistants. And secondly, it might. That'd be another problem, right? Because the kids, the observers might get involved in it, and it might change the nature of the conflict and so forth. So we had some challenges here. One idea, one recent methodology at this time was to put a video up at a dinner table and videotape dinner table conversation. But again, there's some logistical problems and some naturalism problems and so forth. So I did some early work at Natural Institutes of Health when I was a fellow there years before, using a diary methodology. And for parents recording what happens in the home, including marital conflict. And the good thing about a diary methodology is that who's better at observing what's going on and what it means than the actual people involved in the conflict? But we had to keep it kind of simple because you can't fill out diaries after every conflict. So what we knew from the early work, actually if you train parents to code as observers, objective events, not give opinions about what happened long ago, they're good observers. They're as good as research assistants, we found in this early work. Now the bad rap parents get as observers is someone says to the parent, how is your child when, your child's 25 now, what was the child like when they were 2? Well, obviously they're not going to be too accurate, potentially. And that was the kind of research that generated this idea that parents aren't good observers. But if you have parents train them objectively to be observers, which we did, and just say what happened, they're actually quite good at observing what happens in the home, including during marital conflict. And so the question was, what will the diary look like? My first draft of the diary for after every conflict was 16 pages long of questions after every conflict. And I was really into that. But my research team said, no, that's too long. I said, darn, it's good data. And the parents won't care, they just won't do it, or they will get bored. So we actually spent like a couple of years getting the 16 pages of questions based on the literature on types of conflict, ways to respond to conflict, down to one page checklist. During the conflict, what happened emotionally, behaviorally, and they checked the different things that happened, and then they turned it over and they would check what the kid did in response, if the kid was present. A little check at the bottom, child present or not. Okay, and that they could do. But we also had to train them before we sent them out. So actually train them on these different types of behaviors they're supposed to code. Then we tested them in the laboratory. Like, here's a video, what is that kind of conflict? What is that kind of conflict? So you get the parents trained to do the conflicts. Then we send them out into the home and they record conflicts. And then we had mom and dad do it separately. So another type of reliability check was, mom and dad separately coded conflict, and did they see the same thing? And fortunately for me, I was really relieved when we got this finding, they actually had reliability with each other. So they were saying the same things, seeing the same things in the home. So this is a way to get in the actual home and see how parents engaged in conflict and what the impact was on children. One of the questions I think we don't have here, but I want to mention it real briefly, is we had a little checklist at the bottom. A check at the bottom, was the child present or not? The parents would check that. We did a study on this, child present or not, how do parents engage in conflict? Okay, and how often are kids present during conflict? Now, 2/3 of the time, kids were not present during conflict. A lot of parents try not to have conflict in front of kids. But you might think, what happens when they do have it in front of the kids? And we expected they would actually, do better. They'd handle it better emotionally and behaviorally. What we found, though, was the most negative conflicts occur in front of the kids. And we were really puzzled by this at first, but then we kind of thought maybe it's because when they really can't control their anger, they actually express it in front of the kids. When they can, they do it outside of the kids' environment. So that's kind of an interesting finding in that regard. But we did find that we could code different types of conflict, destructive behavior and constructive behavior. By using advanced statistics, we could document the same findings that we found in the laboratory. In other words, destructive conflict behaviors, the very ones I talked about earlier, we showed in the home elicited negative responses from kids. And the constructive behaviors elicited positive responses, okay? So the same pattern of findings in the home that we found in the laboratory with controlled environments. Now in the home, we controlled stimuli statistically. They record these diary events, and there'd be a lot of behaviors occurring, but we could statistically see which were linked with which outcomes. And the constructive behaviors were linked with positive outcomes, not just non-negative outcomes, but positive emotional responses in kids. We also showed the emotionality of parents during fights matters. Negative behavior during fights, negative emotionality was linked with negative outcomes in kids, and positive emotionality is linked with positive outcomes. Which makes sense because emotion is a major conduit for communicating about conflict. So we showed again in the home that constructive conflict is very beneficial. And we showed actual day-to-day behavior in the home. Kids were showing really positive responses to conflict. So in terms of emotional security theory, our model for this, we have evidence then that constructive conflict increases the child's emotional security. Not just neutral, but increases emotional security. It's beneficial to the children. They feel better about the parents' relationship from seeing conflict that's resolved, okay, or handled in a constructive way. Even though these conflicts, they wouldn't be down there on the diary if there wasn't something negative happening. Okay, but if it's resolved or it's handled in a positive way, kids like that. It's a beneficial impact. Here's another study we did looking at aggression and how conflict increases aggression. So destructive conflict that is, we showed in the diaries in the home, increased aggression in kids, okay? And it's like what you expect, except we showed it in the home. Constructive conflict did not increase aggression, though. So, again, we document in the home, like what a lot of clinical studies have shown, in clinics or in laboratory methodologies like observational lab methods or questionnaires, that destructive conflict increased aggressiveness. But constructive did not, except children were really sensitive about fights in front of their children. Okay, so one thing we've been able to do is document the topics of conflict and how they make a difference. Some interesting findings here. Lauren Papp, a former student of mine who's now a tenured professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison, has followed up with this methodology and looking at different topics of conflict. And we got some good responses in the media from these different topics we looked at. And we looked at, like, how do parents fight when they're fighting about money? And we found that they fight differently about money. It's pretty intense. Some recent publications on that. So the topics matter too. In front of children are very sensitive to conflicts about them. Another recent one that we published was about intimacy. How do parents fight about intimacy? And that's an interesting paper too. You can imagine the media like that one. Anyway, it's empirically based, our findings. But all the different topics do matter. Okay, we've been able to document that as well. Okay, so turning back to the main theme though, constructive conflict, positive emotionality, both decrease the probability of aggression and increase the probability of emotional positive responding. So they're definitely positives. Fighting in front of the children, though, is more nuanced in that regard. Okay, now the question is, though, okay, so far what we've shown is that constructive conflict leads to positive emotions from the children during the situation, okay, and does not increase aggression at all, okay? There's no aggression and there's no anger. But are these lasting effects? Are they ephemeral? Is it just like, oh, they're happy to see parents resolving and being constructive? What's the long-term impact? So we did some longitudinal studies looking at what's the impact down the road of seeing constructive conflict. And we found actually constructive conflict increases children's emotional security over time. We've shown this in a number of studies now. Constructive conflict doesn't just, isn't neutral for emotional security, increases emotional security over time. Longitudinally, with all the little statistical controls, autoregressive control, all these different statistical things to isolate the impact. Okay, and we also showed an increased pro-social behavior. So several years later, children exposed to constructive conflict showed more pro-social behavior in school with their peers. So here we are documenting then positive impact on emotional security, which is very important for children, their emotional security about the family. It's very important to a lot of long-term adjustment outcomes. We've shown this in a number of different studies. And we're showing, again, constructive conflict contributes to that. But also constructive conflict has a direct link then with children's pro-social behavior, longitudinally. With statistical controls, so you've worked toward isolating causal effects. Of course, you can never totally isolate a causal effect, but as best you can do with longitudinal research. Okay, that's why we use different methods to kind of, if we get the same finding with all sorts of different methods, each with their pros and cons, we have more confidence. But longitudinal methods show this as well. Okay, so children of parents who handle conflict constructively are more likely to exhibit pro-social behavior and be more emotionally secure. We also showed another recent study that parents who handle conflict constructively also have better parenting behaviors. They're more constructive in their parenting behaviors. So that's another beneficial effect. It's very important. So, of course, the whole family matters for the child's outcomes. The parent-child relationship is very important. Security of the parent-child attachment is very important, as well as security about the family overall, or the parents' relationship with each other. Okay, so the benefits then, coming to the bottom line then, the benefits of marital conflict. Let's see, are many. Okay, marital conflict, when it's constructive, okay, I started out with the premise, not all conflict is bad, which is a good thing because we have conflict, right? I mean, in my own family, we don't have conflict, but I mean, most of you do. No, just kidding. No, I think I undermined that argument earlier. Never mind. No, so you can't turn to like you can't turn to saying, well, I don't have conflict, because you're going to have conflict. And if you avoid expressing it, you stonewall, you avoid it, we actually have evidence now that's even more negative than being overtly hostile. Various longitudinal studies have shown that now in our lab and other labs. So the solution, this is also, the marital researchers have shown this as well. Avoidance is not the solution, okay? And no one's fooled by avoidance, okay? Kids aren't fooled by it, and you're not fooling each other. You have to talk about it, okay? So the message is to talk about it constructively and to try to work it out. You don't have to work it out perfectly. I showed earlier, even progress toward resolution helps, okay? But you need to talk it out, you need to be constructive, try to work toward resolution as best you can. Not avoid it, not get really angry. This whole idea that you could like, a good thing to do is to like vent your anger. Don't do that. That's not, used to see that on TV sometimes with the Nerf bats, hit your spouse. No, that's not good. No. Resolution, constructive conflict behavior. That's the solution. Constructive conflict behavior then, constructive behavior, resolution, increases security in the family and in parent-child relationships, improves children's positive outcomes, pro-social behavior, emotional security, as well as avoiding negative outcomes, no aggression, no negative outcomes. So it's positive in all different regards. So it's a good thing, it's something to be desirable. And it's nice to see a way forward in this regard because you can't recommend not having conflict because that's inevitable. Handle it constructively. And we've incorporated this then in some of our intervention studies, teaching parents how to handle conflict constructively, and then also looking at emotional security as a mediator of effects. It increases emotional security, that increases just better outcomes. We've shown now that if you teach parents, even in a brief intervention like psychoeducational program for a few weeks, will show long-term effects on increasing constructiveness of conflict in the family. We've shown effects lasting for 1 and 2 years later, after a brief 4-week intervention program of just a couple hours. And we've shown that we increase emotional security, and that has beneficial effects, particularly on kids' outcomes, kids' positive outcomes over time. So there's a lot of beneficial effects then, and of constructive conflict, and putting these types of messages and programs also has beneficial effects and leads to positive outcomes. So the bottom line is not whether you fight, but how you fight that matters. In marital relationships, and more, I would say probably more generally. It's not avoiding problems, expressing problems when you have them, but handling them constructively. So I'd like to thank the various grant sources of funding that we have. Administration for Children and Families, William T. Grant Foundation generously supported this research, National Institute of Mental Health, National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and also we've had really grateful support of excellent Notre Dame graduate and undergraduate research assistants, and all the many families that have given so much to contribute to this research. Thank you. Okay, let's have time for questions. Yes. The microphone's not working.
There we go.
Okay.
I'm Richard Bowlby. Thank you so much for that. That was a fascinating talk, and it absolutely parallels much of the early work of people like Dan Stern, where mother and infant are not perfectly attuned. The normal state for the average relationship is not to be optimally attuned. It is the misattunement and the rapid repair of attunement to arrive at a contingent emotional state, which is the most pro-social outcome for a mother-infant. It's where there is not rapid repair for the mother-infant diet. Now, it could be said that the child of a reasonably well-functioning, two reasonably well-functioning individuals in a marriage has actually had that all their life, that the conflict between what the parent is doing and what the baby is doing is in negotiation right from the very beginning. So thank you. So there was one comment which I was thinking, because the word conflict is really a very negative term to my mind. And it's very difficult. It seems to me a complete contradiction to call it positive conflict. It just doesn't, it just sticks in my craw. And we were discussing maybe something like disagreement. So you have a positive disagreement or a negative disagreement or whatever. But I came to the talk anxious about what you were going to say because of your use of the term. And I do accept these terms are difficult. Some people have to call love attachment, but we had to get over that.
Right, right. I think that's an excellent point. It is a challenge for us in research to train parents in the diaries what to record. We don't say conflict, we say difference of opinion, differing emotional reactions to each other. That's the key. That's what's going on. It's not, conflicts is the term that people have used in terms of these matters, but actually that's not the right term. You're right.
Hi, I have a question about length of time to resolution. And is the impact, the positive impact on the child, the same if that resolution between the parents happens in an hour after they observe something going on between the parents, or 24 or 48 hours? So if you could address that.
Well, to the extent we have information on that, we have some information on that, yes. What kids care about, the bottom line of our research is kids care about the meaning of the interaction between the parents. They don't care about what's said necessarily at the heat of the moment when people are really angry. They don't necessarily care about a lot of the negatives that might occur. They care about what does it mean long term? What is the outcome? Did they resolve it? Did they work it out? Were they constructive over time? And the meaning can be gleaned the next day, a week later. We did a study on that, actually. How do they work with information they get much later? And it's the same as if they got it immediately. Because the kids aren't going, oh, was there negativity in my environment? That's not how they respond. They go, what does this behavior mean to my family, to my relationship with my parents relationship with each other? They love their parents. They want their parents to be happy too. That's something sometimes gets forgotten. Kids care about their parents per se with each other and themselves, as well as their own relationship with the parents. But they care about that. If the parents have worked it out, they're doing well. And that's the noble thing. That's a good thing. They worked it out. And of course, kids know things happen, that there's disagreements and problems. They have problems too. So all our research suggests it's the meaning of the net of the interactions, not when it occurs or how intense it is or do they see it immediately. No, next day, even, at some point in time they can get the picture and that'll be fine for them. That's what our research suggests anyway.
Hi, Mark. I definitely agree with your premise, and you have certainly a lot of impressive research. Excuse me. I wanted to raise a case study that, in fact, I experienced, and that is my father couldn't tolerate conflict. And so there was no stonewalling because my mother got the message that, that conflict could not arise in the family context. So consequently, when I got married and I think it was during our honeymoon, we had some conflict. I started panicking, thinking that my wife was going to divorce me after 4 days of marriage. So I had no kind of resilience or capacity to deal with that experience because I had never experienced it. And in talking to students, I find about 10% of my students have similar experience that they also hadn't experienced or even had any kind of exposure to marital conflict. So my question is, if we are advising families to raise the most successful children, how frequently should we recommend parents to have conflict which are resolved successfully, constructively?
Well, thanks, George. That's a good question. There's 7 ways to do it, and there's 3 basic solutions, right? No. My family had no problem with conflict, actually, so it was quite different. The resolution part, maybe not so much, but no, I think, again, it's like responding to the previous question. I think that the matter is you need to learn the other person's cues and what they mean and what the events mean. So over time, you learned your wife, I assume, when she expresses anger, wasn't meaning something drastic. But if you have that context historically, it might take a while. So I guess the message for students might be to learn to understand what people's conflict behaviors or disagreements mean, not just the actual noise involved. We've actually found that how conflict expressed doesn't really matter to kids, like how loud it is, who the actors are even. It's the meaning of the conflict. But I think it can be, in relationships, it takes a while to learn, what does this behavior mean? And that's important. I had a sort of anecdotally experience related to that in that my dad was in the military, and we moved a lot, and I'd go to different neighborhoods. Sometimes we'd live in these really tough neighborhoods, tough city environments. Other times we'd live in these really exotic, nice places like Hawaii. So I had to learn each place we went. What do other kids' behaviors mean? Like in some environments, I learned to respond with, negativity to defend myself, so I wouldn't get bullied when I moved to a new environment. Other places, people look at me like, what's wrong with you, Cummings, And so there's an adjustment. It's a communication pattern one needs to learn every place one goes, including in relationships, I think.
Thanks, Mark. In one of the studies you were describing, you had 53% of the kids, 4 to 5-year-olds, that were able to realize that the parents had resolved the conflict behind doors, closed doors or whatever. But 47% did not. So I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit. Were there gender differences? Were there factors you examined for those differences there?
Well, that's a good question. Actually, the young kids also benefited by seeing what that came out afterwards. Like they benefited by seeing the parents were okay and understood that. It was the response to the question, what were the parents doing behind closed doors? And they weren't as good at guessing as the older kids. Before the resolution, or before the parents came back, they were just as good at understanding when the parents came back that things were okay if they acted like it was okay. Now, gender differences are a really interesting area. When you get gender differences in this area, the citation counts go up for your papers, but we often don't get them. George knows this, right? People want to see that boys and girls fight differently and whatever, respond differently, but the net result of all the research is that it's not a reliable finding. There's differences between people and how they respond that are interesting, but gender is not a really big moderator. So we can't find a reliable difference. I guess there are some differences out there, and so that are interesting, but overall it's not as clear.
I read some research some years ago which said that children of friendly divorces were much more confused than children of aggressive divorces and went into their own relationships thinking that one day this might suddenly stop because there had apparently been no reason for the friendly marriage the good marriage to stop. And I wondered if you had any comments about that.
That's an interesting question. I'm aware of those findings. And ultimately, I guess the divorce wasn't friendly, but kids just didn't know what was going on. Unfortunately, it was hidden from them effectively, and that's problematic. I mean, I'm not going to recommend fighting every week in front of the kids or something, but on a regular basis, expressing your relationship. But it would be very confusing and upsetting for children to find out the parents weren't getting along they thought they were. That's really a hard thing for kids, very hard. Last question. Oh, I'm taking Narsh's orders here, so. Anything else? Oh, there's someone, last minute question, good.
I just had a quick question about where the training that you developed, where that will be deployed or how that will be shared or pushed out to the greater good.
How do we do the interventions?
Yeah.
Yeah, we do it at the Center for Children and Families off campus right now, which is a community center. We basically a psychoeducational format. So we have the parents come in small groups for about an hour, and we talk about messages of research and how to handle conflict better, answer questions. We have a different theme each week. We have a 4-week program. And then we also supervise parents in handling conflicts. We have parents find an issue that they have trouble with and talk about it in front of one of our trained, what do we call them? What's that? Communication coaches, right. Communication coaches who then go through, no, don't say, I hate your guts. Say, one hates your guts, You are a person who, objectively speaking, no. But we have these sort of training things we do. And it's very effective. And we're actually exploring doing it in other countries with high conflict in the environment. We'll see how that goes. But we've been doing it right now in community families. And we're starting to do it with high-risk families as well. But it's based psychoeducational. And we try to gear it so that it could be widely accessible for training, so manualized, so people can use it in communities without having advanced degrees, and can access it to the communities in a really inexpensive, widely available way. Thanks for that question.